Thank you, Ambassador, for your comprehensive presentation in such a short time slot. The other two respondents will speak from their places and will save time through this procedure. Please, Mr. Sandgren.
Thank you very much, and I just want to say thanks to Amos and everybody else from the Institute for the great honor of being here and for the chance to come back to Israel and catch up with so many friends. You've heard now both in the main presentation and Ambassador Shapiro's comments about the status of the U.S.-Israeli relationship. I come to this as a reporter sitting in Washington trying to measure these things by talking to all sides. And I have to say that my impression is that in the first term, the relationship was not anywhere near as bad as was sometimes advertised, particularly here. And in the wake of the president's visit, probably less is improved than one would have thought from the initial enthusiasm that came from what, by all accounts, was a very successful visit here. The reason I say that is that in the first term, for the reasons that Ambassador Shapiro has laid out, the underlying strategic relationship was frequently a whole lot better than the music that surrounded it. Ambassador mentioned Iron Dome and David Sling, the kind of arms deal that you just saw signed, although I think one of the most interesting things about that was linking at this time with Arab states that also have been part of the coalition in dealing with Iran. The ambassador mentioned cooperation on cyber, something I've written a fair bit about, and I would say that the depth of the cooperation as the United States and Israel experimented for the first time with the use of an entirely new weapon, and this was Operation Olympic Games, showed, whatever you think of the success of the operation itself, showed a degree of coordination between the United States and Israel that I think was extremely tight. That doesn't say that there aren't tensions that are going to be going forward, and you've heard some of those outlined in the group's findings. I think most immediately you're going to see those as tensions over, for lack of a better phrase, and it's the one the president himself has used, red lines. Red lines over what to do and when Syria has crossed some boundary on the use of chemical weapons, on which we heard a lot this morning, and I think for the first time hearing Israel declare, or Israeli intelligence and military officials saying very clearly that they believe Syria has already used those weapons, a finding the U.S. has not fully signed on with yet. And certainly red lines on Iran, an area where, as you heard, the problem has been defined quite differently between a president who is saying that the major issue is when they actually get a weapon and an Israeli position about when they get capability. These all go to not only differing perceptions of how much risk you can take, but I think to some degree differing perceptions of national interest, because no matter how close a set of allies are, there are differences, just as there are differences in national interest between the U.S. and Britain, between the U.S. and Japan. There will always be differences of perception about national interest between the U.S. And Israel. This gets to what I think is one of the most interesting and surprising elements of the Obama foreign policy thus far, at least what we've seen in the first 4 years and a few months. If you think back to the 2008 campaign, the way the president defined his strategy going forward was pretty much in terms of engagement. He talked about engaging America's adversaries, and among those that were named at the time were, of course, Iran and North Korea. There was discussion of Cuba and Venezuela, even of tiny Myanmar, what used to be Burma. There was also discussion of getting America out of wars, what President Obama referred to as a dumb war, which was his term for Iraq, and talking about committing new resources to what he called a war of necessity in Afghanistan. What you've seen 4 years later is an administration that has surprised us in several regards. First of all, engagement did not work out quite as well as he had hoped. In fact, you could say he's been batting 1 for 5, to use the baseball analogy. Myanmar worked. The other 4 still have a bit of a way to go. The second thing that I think did not come out in the 2008 campaign, but we've seen more dramatically since, is the emergence of something of an Obama doctrine about when the U.S. will intervene abroad and when it will not. And while no administration wants to lay out a doctrine very clearly, because if they do, annoying reporters will come along and ask how each and every step they take matches up with their doctrine, you can see by how the Obama administration has acted that there is an emerging doctrine coming out. And basically it is this. If the United States sees its own direct interests threatened, it will act, I think, as unilaterally as the Bush administration did. And the classic case here is the bin Laden raid. To some degree, you might say that that is true as well in the case of Iran, which fits into a question not just of Israel's interests or the region's interests, but the president's deep belief in the nonproliferation agenda that he described in Prague 4 years ago last month. But the second element of it, and what made it different from President Bush's time before that, is that if the president determines that there is no direct American interest, then he is looking to allies, partners, others in a region to take on a much greater share of the risk. And that, I think, has taken the world a lot more time to get accustomed to. It helps explain why he was only willing to take a leading role in Libya for a couple of weeks and insisted that NATO take the lead after that. And then we can set aside for another talk what happened when that occurred, why the U.S. had to go resupply NATO with ammunition, even though NATO was fighting an enemy that wasn't shooting back. But in that case, I think the president was trying to lay out an argument for other regional players taking a major role first. You've certainly seen it in Syria, and the president has made it very clear in both his public and less public comments that he views Syria as a very different and much more complex issue than Libya was, because the opposition is not in one place. It's spread out. It has many different interests. It's got some al-Qaeda influences in elements of it, or certainly jihadist influences in some elements of it. Unclear how to go help some of these groups and which ones to help. And that has taken a very long time to clarify, probably much longer than many in the administration would like. In fact, we've reported that Secretary of State Clinton and David Petraeus, when he was still CIA director, argued for arming the rebels directly, and they were voted down. I think the greatest voice of caution here has been from the president himself. You've also seen the president turn to a light footprint strategy. And this has been a strategy of avoiding the big attritional wars that we saw in the past 10 years. I think it's fair to say the United States views it as unlikely that it will send 100,000 troops into a country for 5 or 6 years, try to rewire that country's internal workings, and then discover that we've built up a fair bit of resentment by being there. Instead, the light footprint strategy has been defined really by 3 major intervention weapons, separate and apart from the diplomacy that Ambassador Shapiro and his colleagues do. Those have been drones, a program that has been expanded quite dramatically. There were 48 drone strikes in Pakistan alone during the entire Bush administration. There were more than 300, or roughly 300, during the first 4 years of the Obama administration. Much increased use of cyber, of which the program against Iran has been the most notable, and much greater use of special forces, one area of the military where you're seeing an increase in the budget at a time that many other areas are getting cuts. What do these have in common? They all go in and move out fairly quickly. And I think one of the big questions that we're facing as the administration goes into its next 4 years is whether or not this light footprint strategy is beginning to run out of gas, whether we are seeing in Syria or in the case of using cyber weapons, or even in some cases for special forces, that it's no longer as easy as it may have been when the president had the element of surprise, the element of newness to using each of these. I've used up my time before we've even had a chance to turn to the Palestinian issues and the other subjects we've been discussing, but I hope we'll have a chance to return to those when we get back into the more general conversation. Again, thank you very much for having me here today.
Thank you, David.